Thank you for joining Hudson Institute today for this conversation on Colombia. We have a very distinguished guest today. Francisco Santos served as Vice President of Colombia during the presidency of Álvaro Uribe from 2002 to 2010, which through its strategy of democratic security brought about a dramatic transformation in Colombia. More recently, he served as Ambassador to the United States from 2018 to 2020. Mr. Santos, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dan, and for me, it's a pleasure to be here, especially an institute that John Walters, a good friend, heads. I worked with him a lot when I was vice president. He was a drug czar during the Bush administration, great policymaker, and a great friend of Colombia. So I'm very glad to be here with you.
Thank you. You recently described President Gustavo Petro as the greatest enemy of Colombian democracy. Can you talk about how you have come to this view and how you see Petro's presidency playing out during the remainder of his term?
Let me just start by telling you that Petro is not alone. Petro is part of a new wave of authoritarianism in the region. It's now called illiberal democracy, which is not democracy at all. You had in the early 2000s Chavez, then you had Correa, this new populism. Then you had Evo, on the other hand. Then you had Ortega. Two of them are gone, Correa and Evo. Those countries were able to avoid falling into the trap that Venezuela and Nicaragua fell. Venezuela and Nicaragua are today very authoritarian, countries, dictatorships, very much involved in drug trafficking. And Petro is this new wave. This new wave where you have AMLO in Mexico. AMLO wants to create a one-party state. Let's not make any excuses for what's happening. The reform in the judicial system that he wanted to concentrate it and to finally eliminate democracy in Mexico with a new free type of modern institutionality, but that radically eliminates democracy. You have Bukele in El Salvador. They still have some limited elements of democracy there, but without a doubt, due process, separation of powers, and the constraint, the elements, basic elements of democracy are not there. And obviously, Petro is also part of this illiberal type of democracy in Colombia. And he has tried to implement it, and he hasn't been as successful as others because institutions have pushed back. And why have they pushed back? Because when you look at Colombian history, since 1834, we have had a democracy. The second oldest democracy in the region is Colombia. Nobody knows about that. Number one, the U.S., number two, Colombia. We have had very limited stoppages of democracy in these almost 200 years of voting and changing government through votes. We had one in the early 1900s and one in the middle 1900s, and both were of 4 years. And society as a whole, the parties as a whole, took those dictators on. So we have institutions. But he has tried. And how has he tried? First, the first thing is that very early, when the Attorney General wasn't his, and here we have a system in which the Attorney General, in the middle of the term, is nominated by the president and elected by the Supreme Court. He had 2 years with President Duque's Attorney General, which was very strong against him, which had very clear issues regarding corruption. And he said, you can't do that. I am the boss of the Attorney General, which he wasn't. In Colombia, the Attorney General is part of the judicial system. It's independent from the Supreme Court, it's independent from the executive, but it's part of the judicial process. Obviously, he got a lot of backlash, but that just looks at his mind. He said, I'm the head of state, so everything must obey me. Well, that's not how it works, but it shows clearly what he thinks. When he had to nominate the Attorney General, the Supreme Court was questioning many of the Attorney Generals, said, there's no freedom, there's not going to be freedom there. And you had like a takeover of the Attorney General of the Supreme Court. It was lots of people going to the Supreme Court and making noise and creating havoc. in the surroundings of the Supreme Court, which in Colombia has a very important element of history. You have to remember that the Supreme Court was taken over by the M19 guerrilla group in 1985 and killed most of the members of the Supreme Court and the Council of State. So this pressure that was instigated by the president shows how he thinks. Either I get it your way or I get it my way. So I want it my way and I'll get it even through force. And he finally got his attorney general, and obviously his attorney general has shown that she is not independent, that she does what the president wants. And I'll give you some examples. He's trying to free convicted elements of the first line, and she can't. That needs a whole different process to go through Congress. But she wanted to do that. She's trying to do that. That's going to go to the Supreme Court and to the Constitutional Court, and probably those decisions are going to be taken back. So she's trying to do something like that. She's obviously strengthened the cases and moved the cases, even though there have been many years against the rivals of President Petro. And the case of Álvaro Uribe is very clear. In the first month of the accusation against Álvaro Uribe went forward, even though in the past, in the former attorney generals and the former government, the attorney general said, look, there's no evidence. The judge says, you gotta go through with it. And they changed the decision, the attorney generals. They suddenly found some type of evidence. We don't know in Colombia what new evidence is. There's no new evidence, but it shows the politicization of the judicial system. And finally, the cases against the president in terms of his family, in terms of huge corruption scandals, have died down. So he has the attorney general in his pocket. Second, he's gone after Congress. And he's gone after Congress saying, I need a new constituent assembly that I can manage so that I can go over Congress. Congress said, sure, put the bill in Congress and we will see if we will allow you to have a constitutional assembly, which he very clearly said he was not going to go after that when he was a candidate. But as a president, he's trying to get that constituent assembly. But I'll give you an example. The reform of the health system. Colombia had the number 6 health system in terms of quality in the world. 6, not 15, not 20, not 30, 6 in quality and in coverage. He wants to aesthetize and to have the state become the only provider of the health system. Today is mixed. The state pays it, but private companies provide it through insurance. And when Congress said, no, you will not accept your law, they turned it down. He decided to strangle the system through fiscal decisions. He did not send the money to the system, and the system is just starting to collapse and giving up. Okay, we're not going to provide the system if you're not going to pay for what it used to be paid before. So he doesn't care whether Congress decides if his change is okay or not. He still wants to get things done his way. Security, another element. He's destroyed the army and the police. He's taken away almost 50 generals in the police and in the army. The generals that were trained with the U.S., that were trained in the fight against the illegal organizations, against the FARC, against the ELN, generals that had been well seasoned in combat. Most of them had been in the years that we were president and vice president with Uribe in the terrains, that knew about it. Members of the military trained in human rights, but also trained in intelligence. He took away all that. So we lost 25 years of training, 25 years of knowledge, 25 years of the best quality of generals in Latin America, not only Colombia, in Latin America. We had the best considered army and navy and air force and police in Latin America. Well, he's trying to destroy it. Other generals and majors and captains and colonels are saying, I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to be part of this new police he wants to create. So he's institutionally destroying it. He's creating ceasefires supposedly with paz total, total peace, ceasefires in many areas that aren't enforced. He doesn't allow the police or the military to do anything against those illegal groups. So we're going back to 25 years in the late 20th century, early 21st century, when the illegal groups were owned territories. That's the other element that is happening, and it's creating havoc in terms of security. And finally, the discourse. Anybody who's against him is a Nazi. Anybody who opposes his position is a criminal. Anybody who criticizes the government is an extremist, anti-Colombian, as I said before, Nazi, etc. So his discourse is only trying to fuel more and more this the destruction of society and the creation of a collision in society that can end up in a civil war. We're not there yet. He's been such a horrible president in terms of execution, in terms of getting results that a lot of people are certainly saying this is horrendous. But he still has 30% approval rate. 30% of Colombians still think he can do a lot of good things for Colombia. And that's a big danger, because with that 30%, he can reach second round in the next election. And with buying votes, owner of the state, everything he wants to do, he can elect the next president in 2026. Said that, and to finish, I don't think he wants to go. He wants to stay. And I think he's going to try to implement a constitutional assembly by force. And we have to be very aware of how he thinks and how he operates to prepare for what is coming, especially in the next year.
Yeah. So on the topic of the Constituent Assembly, you referred to Colombia's strong institutions and the sort of institutional restraints that have bothered Petro. Are those institutional restraints strong enough to hold back that his push for an assembly? Also, I understand, when he shook up his cabinet this summer, the aim was for one of the new cabinet members to sort of lead the charge on the Constituent Assembly. And is that providing more clarity or structure to what he's trying to do on this front?
No, not at all. And not at all, because he's totally disconnected from this cabinet. This is like his 6th, 7th, 8th cabinet. I don't remember. In 2 years. We've never seen that. But, when you go into a position of power like a cabinet, only to learn where you turn the light on, it takes a week. And so you need months to prepare to execute. And so when they're starting to find out how things work, they take him out. So that's part of the inefficiency that has created havoc. Nobody wants to be part of this. Nobody who has a technical framework wants to be part of this institutionality. Today, 2 of the highest and most prepared members of the Ecopetrol, the state-owned company, are resigning because they're saying, I don't want to be part of the destruction of Ecopetrol, which is, by the way, a provider of 10% of the revenues of the state. So you're still seeing a very inefficient government in power trying to get things done. So beyond government pressure, etc., he's not going to get anything done. But I've never thought that he wants to have the Constitutional Assembly through Congress or through. No, he's not going to be able to do that because institutionality is strong enough. He wants to impose it. And how do I think he wants to impose it? He's gonna use the same instrument that he used in 2021 to create havoc in Colombia. But it's called the social, social protests, which are not social protests, which is instrumentalization of violence with illegal groups and protesters, which he called the first line, blocking cities with elements of violence, with very few people, less than 2,000, 3,000 people, And when he's going to do that in early next year, middle of next year, they're going to block the cities and say, President Petro, we will only take this out if you have a constitutional assembly. And he's going to say to the army and the police, you can't free the roads. This is a social protest. So we need as citizens to decide, okay, the police is not going to be there, the army is not going to be there, the citizens are going to do it. We're going to do it peacefully, but we're going to do it. And through mass concentration, we're going to confront those thousands, very few thousands, or sometimes hundreds here and there, and let them know that they're not going to be able to maintain that blockade. That's how I think he's going to try to impose a constitutional assembly. He always goes to the violent elements of how he got into power, which is what he knows the most. He's not a Democrat.
So very sobering. Can you talk about what Petro is trying to achieve with his total peace strategy and where you see that heading?
I think it's heading to the empowerment of the illegal groups. I think it's heading to a growth of the drug traffickers and drug trafficking organizations that will work like they work in Venezuela. Venezuela is a narco state. Mexico is a narco state. Mexico drug traffickers own a lot of the governorships and the cities in Mexico. They're a very important political player in the game. And AMLO was able to, to bring him in with the abrazos and no balazos type of speech, of letting go the son of El Chapo when he was captured, of really doing to a certain extent and be aggressive with what Petro is doing today, which is dismantling the armed forces and having no real attack against drug traffickers. Here it's happening. I think if you do the analysis of how many hectares of coca we have, we're probably around 300,000. The U.S. and President Batlle all of a sudden said, no, we're not going to measure coca anymore. Just to, when Petro got into power, just to not antagonizing him. So I guess the new government, if it decides to really have a policy of understanding how big the drug problem is going to be, and it's being in Colombia, in Latin America, in Ecuador, because all of this is being intertwined. And from Mexico all the way to Argentina, you're having the drug traffickers playing a different role than they played in the 80s and in the 90s and in the 2000s. They're becoming very important political players in the region with strength, with assassinations. What happened in Ecuador is just an example, and territorial control. And you're seeing this Mexico all the way down to the Patagonia, with obviously different elements of penetration, but with similar consequences. So I think he wants to have that. The ELN and the FARC, I don't see them, they're growing. They're getting more powerful. The state's not challenging them. And what you're seeing them is increasing their stature, increasing their territorial control. So I think in the peace total, what he wants to have is have an ally in those illegal organizations that he can use in the future. And to a very clear picture of what is happening, if he's going to need them for the imposition of constitutional assembly and creating the havoc that will allow him to have that, I think they will respond positively and help in terms of creating the chaos in Colombia that can finally bring his constitutional assembly to a realization. So it's a mixture of that. And look, he comes from a guerrilla that knew how to use what they call the combinations of the forms of war, political and military, violent and non-violent. And he's very good at it. So he understands how he can use this discourse, but enforce it with the use of violence. So he's an expert on that. He used it in 2021, and I'm afraid he's going to use it again.
So do you see a link between his negotiations with criminal groups and the record coca cultivation that we saw last year?
Of course. Look, he said at the UN, oil is worse than coca. That just shows his frame of mind. Mm-hmm. So he said, I'm not going to go after coca growing. So we haven't, in 2 years and a week, we haven't eradicated 1 hectare of coca. One, we haven't. So what you're seeing is a big increase of coca production. This increase in coca production with the new structures that are being created in the region with the Mexican cartels, the influence of the Jalisco and Nueva Generación here in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Latin America is growing. The influence of the the Albanese mafia and the Russian mafia is increasing in many of the areas. Venezuela has become a hub of drug trafficking. It's sort of the New York Stock Exchange today of drug trafficking. That's where it goes, that's where it's sold, that's where it's moved around without any problem. So Petro understands that drug traffickers have become new power brokers and he's going to need them. And through these negotiations, he is distracting efforts from going after them and also allowing them to gain more power and therefore have them as allies for what he needs in the future. That's where I see this going.
I want to talk about Venezuela a little.
Sure.
President Petro, probably has more influence with Nicolas. His role in talks with Maduro. What do you think he should be doing?
It doesn't matter what I think he should be doing. It's what he's doing. Obviously, he is helping him gain time. He understands the difficulty he's in, and so he hasn't given Maduro the recognition that he wants from Colombia. He's worked with Lula, but he's gaining to a certain extent a little bit of time. But the situation internally is so difficult for Maduro that he can't work the same way he used to work, where he gained time to negotiations and then he ended up doing whatever he wanted. When Maduro changes his cabinet and puts Diosdado as head of Interior, etc., it shows how scared they are. It shows how fragile that situation is. And so it's a day-to-day, Maduro is looking for day-to-day management of a bad situation that is getting worse. Petro is giving him some of that, but without giving him the full recognition that he wants. He has gained the antipathy, how can I say, the bad reaction from Maduro and even from Ortega. Ortega went after Petro. Petro responded, but it just showed that even though Petro is not a Democrat, he understands that he still lives in a democratic context, and he understands that giving Maduro and allowing Maduro to go through with this absolutely clear stealing of elections will have a big impact on him. So he's also thinking of the future of his party here, and he understands that Venezuela plays a big role. So I don't see him being able to play any constructive role now or in the future. I see Maduro being more isolated. I think Lula and Petro, AMLO obviously has said, I have nothing to do with it. That's a decision of the Venezuelans. But I really thought that Petro would be able to have more influence. He hasn't, and to a certain extent he hasn't because his ideological view of Venezuela is similar to what he has, but his political interests in Colombia conflict with that. So I don't see him doing anything different than what he's doing, which is managing the situation, but not deciding where he's going to.
Can you talk about how the situation in Venezuela is intertwined with Colombia's own security?
Not only security, and not only Colombia. Look, if the situation in Venezuela is maintained as it is, you're going to have 8 million Venezuelans leaving Venezuela in the next year and a half. Guess where those Venezuelans are going? They don't want to stay in Colombia, because in Colombia we already have 2.5 million, 3 million Venezuelans. They don't want to go to Latin America. They're going to go to the States. You're going to have even bigger influx of migration that you had at the worst moment. So the solution is going to be very, very, very important. And this solution requires the Maduro government to leave. And we don't know what the U.S. is going to do. The present administration is not pushing the right buttons. It's doing the right actions. It's saying the right things, but it's not pushing any of the buttons that need to be pushed. So you're going to have a massive migration in Latin America of Venezuelans. That creates economic instability. That creates conflicts of migration. That creates an increasing criminality in the region. And that is one of the biggest consequences of not solving the Venezuelan problem. The second, regarding Colombia, has to do with security. The ELN, as a matter of fact, they said, we're going to protect Maduro. The ELN has become the first multinational guerrilla in the region in Latin America in its history. The ELN is strengthening every day because it's involved in drug trafficking that operates freely there. It's involved on all types of illegal businesses, so it's getting strong. The FARC is also there without any problems. So they're making money and they're getting strength in Venezuela too. And the drug traffickers, obviously, the third element of this, are making a lot of money in Venezuela. So the Venezuelan situation is empowering the illegal organizations that operate in Colombia. So for Colombia, the solution of the Venezuelan crisis is critical to really have a future, and let's say a bright future. We have a future, but it's going to be more difficult with the crisis in Venezuela that we have now. And unfortunately, I think that's also one of the reasons why Petro cannot allow the dictatorship to maintain. He knows he's going to have in the next 2 years 8 million Venezuelans coming through Venezuela to Colombia, and that will hinder his electoral process in 2026. So it's security, it's drug trafficking, it's illegal organizations, it's migration, and the first country that will feel the brunt of it is without a doubt Colombia.
It seemed like Petro was making maybe some concession to the opposition when he convened his Foreign Affairs Advisory Committee to talk about Venezuela. Do you see any opening there, or was that just an empty gesture? What do you think?
No, it's always an empty gesture. He's called for a national agreement, and the day he called for a national agreement, in the morning, at night, he's going after bankers. He's going after the private sector. His discourse is not of, let's try to do things together. His discourse is, you are the Nazi violators of human rights, the rest of them, us, and I am the savior of the country. That's the discourse that he has. It's a discourse that today, 25 to 30% of Colombians are still following. Some of them are believing me harshly. I guess 15% don't, but they say, let's give him more of a chance. So he hasn't had one serious gesture of trying to do something in accordance to the law, to discussions, and to give as much a stake. He doesn't have that mentality. He just wants to take. And if this gesture was to justify what he's going to do next, which today I don't know what it is, but if he wanted to do that, I think it went out because President Uribe said, I'm not going. Juan Manuel Santos said, I'm not going. President Pastrana said, I'm not going. President Gaviria said, I'm not going. And the only one who was going to go is President Samper, which is very close to Petro. So it's a failed, and let's say a failed proposition, but not because the other side didn't want to. It's because there's no credibility, and Petro only uses people for his own purpose, not for something that is good for Colombia.
Colombia faces a very difficult fiscal situation. You mentioned Ecopetrol and how how much of the budget comes from oil revenue. The economy has stalled, growing at a very low rate. Is Colombia going to continue to see this low growth and fiscal concerns during the next 2 years, or what do you see things improving?
No, things are not going to change. Things are not to improve. I think the economy is going to keep tanking. I think if the labor reform is passed, you're going to see unemployment zoom and go really high. Informality is going to go also even higher than it is today, because it makes it impossible to pay for formal jobs. Nobody's investing. Nobody wants to invest in Colombia, not even Colombians, because of the insecurity that you have, the physical insecurity, the judicial insecurity. There's no confidence. President Petro has destroyed the confidence of investors in Colombia, which was something that took so many years to build. And in only 2 years, he destroyed it. But that's part of his mentality. They want to destroy what's working, because a poorer country creates a country that is in more dependence of the state, and those who depend on the state are going to vote for them, which is what the Kirchner's did in Argentina until they couldn't afford. And Argentina is twice as rich as Colombia. You don't have the riches here, but Petro once said, it's on the social media. He said, poor people, as soon as they move into the middle class, they become rightist. They go to the right politically. Being said that, he only wants people who are poor because they are the ones, they're his market. So he doesn't want more people in the middle class. He doesn't want the country improving. He wants the country going exactly in the different direction, with no respect for the institutional framework, which is something that Boric, even though I disagree with him 100%, he's respectful of institutionality. What he has said in Venezuela, what he has done with Venezuela, what he has done with human rights is something that my hat's off, because it shows that even a member of the Communist Party of Chile that is president of Colombia understands that democracy needs separation of powers, that democracy needs respect for human rights, not only inside but outside, and that in that sense, that discourse has to be coherent. Is that something that Petro hasn't learned? Obviously, that's something that AMLO never learned. That's something that Bukele hasn't learned. And it's something that for Díaz-Canel in Cuba, or Ortega in Nicaragua, or Maduro in Venezuela, they don't care.
Petro feels besieged by the press, and he's increasingly lashed out at journalists by name. As a journalist yourself, are you concerned about increasing pressure on journalists and on the media?
Yes, obviously. In Colombia, in a country with so many illegal groups, putting somebody, and especially a journalist who she has uncovered a lot of the corruption, etc. And she's been straightforward, not only with this government and before too. She's always she's in Petro's head. She's always putting her forward as part of the problem. It creates a lot of risk for her. But other journalists and other media that all of a sudden say, hey, like 2 days before, this week, a problem of the state, institutions of the government didn't make a decision, and all of a sudden Colombia was left, and some airports in Colombia were left without gasoline for airplanes. And so companies started canceling flights, and the newspaper said, look, this is a problem of the state of the government. No, he immediately came out and said, this is a problem of the media. The media are trying to portray it differently. He uses that to distract from his own inefficiency, his corruption, and his lack of competence in managing the situation. Well, AMLO did too. AMLO used to really permanently go after the media. He went even after a journalist from the New York Times. So they need, this new populism needs an enemy. And a very easy enemy to have is the media, is the free media. AMLO did it in Mexico, Petro is doing it in Colombia, with the difference. It's a lot, well, not the difference anymore, because Mexico has become the most dangerous country for journalists now. Colombia used to be the most dangerous country for journalists in the 80s and in the 90s, even up to the 2000s, early 2000s. And we changed that during the government, during the years in government. But still, it creates a lot of pressure. It creates self-censorship, but especially it puts a lot of those journalists and media at risk.
I want to finish up by talking about U.S. Colombia relations. The United States and Colombia have been, in the past, were strong partners. Colombia was United States' strongest partner in the region for decades. What will it take to restore that relationship in the future?
The first thing is that military and intelligence security gone, eliminated. No intelligence agency in the world is cooperating with the Colombian government now. Why? Because they understand how much they're trying to destroy the intelligence agencies that we had, which were some of the best in the region. That's gone. Cooperation in other areas is gone too. Petro went to Washington and said to the members of the Appropriations Committee in Congress in the U.S., I don't give a damn about American money. Okay, so it's probably going to go next, 50% less this year. And I think what we were able to build during decades, especially after with the Pastrana administration, the Uribe administration, with the Santos administration with different emphasis, and with the Duque administration, that's gone. All those 25 years of cooperation, of history, of common ground, of common enemies, and of common objectives is gone. How to build it? It's going to be very difficult, but it's going to be needed. And hopefully the next government will not only will send the right signals and do the right things to first recuperate security, which is critical. Second, to recuperate trustful dialogue between Congresses, between presidents, between administrations, which is not happening today. And thirdly, build a map in which we can work together in many areas: migration, decoupling of the economy with China, nearshoring. I think Colombia can become a huge partner in nearshoring, security, which is a critical fight against drugs. So there are issues in which we can start working, but for the next 2 years, forget about it. That's it. That alliance, that relationship is gone. It's history.
Mr. Santos, thank you very much for your time today. You've given a very, very comprehensive look at what's happening in Colombia. Clearly, there is a lot that bears watching. So I hope that we can continue the conversation in the future, and that this will be the first of many discussions on Colombia. But thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to our audience.